Okay, so in the last video, we looked at the fight or flight response that occurs when our sympathetic nervous system becomes activated, and that then triggers the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands. However, that is not the only system that is involved in our stress response. We also have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Just remember HPA axis. On the exam, I will have it written both ways. So if you just remember HPA axis, that's fine. It's not as complicated as it sounds though. Basically, in response to a stressor, the hypothalamus sends a message to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland sends a message to the adrenal glands, which then causes the release of cortisol. So one part of the adrenal glands releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, and now we have a different part that is releasing cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It is a hormone that helps provide a boost of energy when we first encounter a stressor. Basically, it increases the blood sugar level so that we have the energy to either fight or flee the situation. Now, in moments of stress, not only does this cause this or trigger this boost in energy, it also decreases pain sensitivity. So we've spoken before, when we talk about the gate control theory of pain, while pain is adaptive, it lets us know something's wrong, there are also moments where we need to switch off from that. So I think the example I used in that video is if you have a knee injury and you're walking home late at night and someone started chasing you and you needed to run for your life, you need to be able to switch off from that pain in your knee, because otherwise you're going to have a hard time running. And so what you'll see is in response to a stressor, when that cortisol is released, that helps decrease your sensitivity to pain so that you can focus on dealing with the stressor and fighting or fleeing rather than focusing on the pain. The other thing that cortisol does is it improves the immune system temporarily. I really want to emphasize here that it is temporarily. And the reason being is because, in fact, long-term continuous elevated levels of cortisol, so usually in response to chronic stress, that actually weakens the immune system. So if you're chronically stressed, if the stress level is going on for a long time and your body just keeps pumping out cortisol, eventually your immune system is going to become weakened. Those resources are going to be depleted, and this is when you start to see people becoming sick and run down. Now, you'll notice that throughout these videos, I'm not focusing very much on the negative health consequences of stress. Your book talks about it, so you can read about it in there. The reason I want you to be aware that there are negative health consequences, but if you would like to know why I'm not going to spend too much time discussing it, you will need to watch the video that is coming up on how to make stress your friend, and that will hopefully make it clear why I'm not spending too much time on convincing you that stress is bad for you. So another theory of stress that we need to look at is the general adaptation syndrome proposed by Hans Seeley. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. Basically, Seeley noticed that prolonged exposure to stressors caused rats to show these physiological responses. So things like adrenal enlargement, they had stomach ulcers. And basically, this pattern of physiological reactions occurred regardless of what the stressor was. So it didn't matter what he was doing to the rats. If they were under a state of stress, these physiological reactions would occur. And so that led him to define stress as a non-specific, or the body's non-specific physiological response to a stressor. So basically, he's suggesting that our bodies will respond to prolonged stressors, so ongoing stressors, in a predictable way. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the stressor is. It doesn't matter whether it's work, money, family life, relationships. If our body experiences stress over a prolonged period of time, he said that the physiological response continues to be the same. We can predict what that's going to be. And he called this predictable response the general adaptation syndrome. Now, this breaks our response down into 3 stages that he said the body goes through. So we first have the alarm stage. This is very similar to going into fight or flight. Basically, he said that the alarm stage is where the physiological arousal increases as the body is preparing to deal with the threat. So your body is responding. There's been a stressor, and your body is preparing to deal with that. You're in a high state of physiological arousal, very much the same as Walter Canham was describing when he described fight or flight. Now, if the stress continues, we go into the resistance stage. So at this point, the body maintains a high level of arousal, but it starts to adapt or to readjust. And so as much as it remains alert and aroused, the physiological reaction diminishes. It's not quite as intense anymore. Now, one of the issues with that, when you're in this state of resistance, is that the body can no longer address new stresses. Because if you're already in a state of heightened stress, your body is already physiologically aroused to deal with that. Even though the physiological arousal has gone down during this stage slightly, it is now resistant to new stresses. It's already activated, so it is now, it becomes resistant. I was trying to think of another word there. And so you'll notice that when people are in this stage of resistance, they no longer experience that same physiological or heightened sense of arousal that they would when they first came into contact with the first stressor. Now, if the stress continues, the last stage is exhaustion. Now, part of this might be physical exhaustion, feeling very, very fatigued, but it's more than that. The exhaustion stage is when the person's body can't adapt anymore, as it was in the resistance stage, and the body's resources have become completely depleted. And so at this point, this is when people become vulnerable for getting sick or developing diseases, feeling physically exhausted. And as Seeley suggested, in some extreme cases, can lead to death. But the point is the body is completely depleted of the resources it needs to keep you healthy. Your immune system becomes very, very weak during the exhaustion stage. So again, that links to what we looked at on the last slide with chronic stress. Your cortisol levels are increasing, your body's constantly pumping out cortisol, and over time that is going to deplete those resources, and your immune system will be too weak.